In 1976, 5-year-old Ada Lawson went missing for 3 days during a family camping trip. Her rescuers were surprised to find her in relatively good health, considering the amount of time she had been alone. Though the local press reported on the incident, Ada's parents denied anybody the opportunity to interview her, stating that she had been through enough. However, Ada's experience became a local legend. 30 years later, as the local librarian, Ada agreed to be interviewed by a student working for a regional college newspaper. The interviewer states that as Ada retold her story, she seemed to piece together new realizations from the details she hadn't fully understood as a child. Ada was the youngest of 4 children, and their parents had taken them on what became the last of their annual camping trips. She remembered wandering off, not lost, not at first. She had heard something, a deep, resonant sound, almost like the creaking of trees, but rhythmic, purposeful, not quite a voice, not quite human. Her mother had told her not to wander too far, but when the sound echoed again, low and strange, like wood groaning in the wind, she felt drawn just a few steps further. She kept telling herself she wouldn't go far, but the trees seemed to close behind her, and suddenly the campsite was gone. Then she heard a low growl. She turned to see a mass shifting behind the trees, large, slow, deliberate. She caught only glimpses, a grey flicker behind the leaves, faint steps muffled by damp earth. She hadn't seen it clearly, but something about the presence made her chest tighten with a kind of instinctive dread. She ran. It didn't chase her, but she sensed it was still nearby. Ada was now completely lost. The forest pressed in around her, unfamiliar and vast, every direction looking the same. Panic twisted in her chest as she called out for her parents, but the only answer was a rustling in the trees. A rustling, she hoped, was the wind. During her interview, Ada seemed to remember the hunger the most. There was fear, particularly in the first few hours, especially when night came. But that was soon overcome by the ache in her stomach. Eventually, she found a soft patch of ground under a thick pine and began to cry. At some point, she must have drifted off. When she awoke the next morning, there was a pile of berries near her hand, fresh, untouched. She ate without thinking. It wasn't until she finished eating that she heard the low growl. She looked up to see a hint of grey in the brush and green eyes peeking between the foliage. She ran in the opposite direction. She sensed it following her. She heard it all around her. A growl, something akin to a bark, the sound of claws scraping against stone and log. During her interview, Ada said in describing it now, it felt more like she was being shepherded, like those dogs herding the sheep. Eventually, she found herself at the edge of a creek. The water was clear and cascaded into a small pool. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, and she drank eagerly. She spent the day searching the woods, calling out to her parents. She still cried, but each time she cried, she felt the presence near her, urging her on. She moved away from it, but stopped running. The fear gave way to something quieter, like being observed, not threatened. Each time the presence urged her forward, she would find something new in her path. A pile of berries, uprooted mushrooms, a pile of grubs. She only ate the berries. Night came with a fierce chill, but the guiding presence pushed her in the direction of a large den. Thick pines covered the entrance, blocking the cold wind. She crawled in and fell into a restless sleep, the bite of the cold periodically waking her. Ada paused here in her story, as if unsure. After a moment she mentions that a few times she woke up to a musky, earthy smell. Something was close to her, blocking the wind, sharing its heat. Its hair was coarse but warm, its breathing deep and comforting. The next morning she woke up to another pile of berries and a fresh fish. It looked cleaned, like the way her father cleaned fish when he went fishing. Again, she only ate the berries. She continued wandering the woods that day, calling for her parents, but the weight of her situation felt lighter. She found a fallen branch that made for a great walking stick, or sometimes a scepter for the princess of the forest. As she wandered through the woods, she collected flowers, tying them to the knots and cracks of her stick, crafting a magnificent flowered staff. The presence no longer seemed to be chasing her. It no longer growled or tried to shepherd her. Instead, she would hear a soft pawing of the ground, or a low snort. It wasn't watching her constantly, but she could sense that it was never far. It stayed out of sight, and when she followed it, she would find more piles of food. She even tried the mushrooms. They had a surprisingly meaty texture with their earthy taste. As dusk settled, the woods grew heavier, the light faded, and the warmth and mirth of the day was chased away by the long shadows that stretched and consumed the light. It was then, in the fragile quiet, that she saw it fully. It stepped from the trees just past dusk, a towering figure half in shadow, half in fading light. Its limbs were wrong, too long, ending in knotted joints that seemed more like branches than flesh. Strange, jagged antlers jutted from its head, twisting unevenly. Its face was gaunt and sharp, yet familiar, almost human behind the snout, with black lips and sharp canines. Its green eyes almost glowed in the dim light. Ancient. It didn't move at first. It just watched. And this time, she didn't run. She described reaching out, not with her hand, but with her gaze, holding its eyes. And the strangest thing, she felt in those eyes something she didn't yet understand. It was the same cautious, tender watchfulness her mother had when she let Ada pour her own milk, ready to step in, but letting her try on her own. And then, from another direction, a branch snapped. From there, everything was a blur. Voices, the blinding stab of a flashlight. She turned, gunshots, sharp, violent, echoing through the trees. She screamed, tried to run toward it. Someone grabbed her, their arms so tight it hurt. A deep voice, sounding so foreign after days alone. "It's okay, you're safe now." They told her it was a bear, a wolf. Her parents didn't like her talking about it. They said she was confused, that she'd imagined the rest. But she remembered how its body slumped too quietly for an animal, how the air felt wrong after the shot, the warmth fading, the cold pressing in. For years, she tried to forget. She attended school, made friends, lived in the world her rescuers brought her back to. But sometimes, when everything felt too bright, too loud, she would hear the woods calling, the crack of branches, the taste of fresh berries, the sweetness of cool water, and the protective shape watching over her as she roamed the forest. She dreamed of it still, of the days she should not have survived, the hunger she should have endured, the nights that should have frozen her. And some nights she lies awake and wonders, what would life have been like if she had never been found? Thank you for visiting Archive 19. Your curiosity is appreciated. If you found this story intriguing, consider liking the video to help others uncover it as well. For more stories from obscure sources, subscribe to be notified when the next file is unearthed. New discoveries are released weekly.